Okay, so this is the first class in a session on the planets. I've come in right in the middle of a big diatribe on exactly what this is about, and decided to record halfway through. But this this workshop, this series of workshops that we're doing right now is really, it's not going to be a masterclass. It's not going to be high level hacks or skills or anything that you can employ when it comes to using planets. In a lot of ways, it's really about going back to the basics and the foundations of the planets in astrology, looking at them through the mythology involved with the planets, looking at some of the more nuanced ways that we can interpret planets and their relationships to one another and to the chart. I was just talking about before how mythology, I think, plays an incredible role, because mythology, when you look at it and explore it from the point of view of gods rather than planets, it tells us an evolution of a character. It tells us a story. And in that story, we see an evolution of thousands of years of storytelling, of critical thinking, of interpretation, of creation, all of that sort of stuff. And that contributes to these planets that we've got now. That for many, in many respects, we possibly take for granted. You know, our interpretation is a more coalesced and simplified version of all of this thinking that's been happening all of this time. And we're probably going to go back more to basics and to looking at that sort of stuff. That being said, this is only the first session. I don't know what to expect. So it's going to evolve. I'm inviting people to become involved and share their voice and share their views and tell me more about what they want to see and what they don't want to see and things like that. But that's where we'll be starting from today. And we'll be going back to basics while we do that. How does that sound? Does that sound okay? Yeah?
Perfect.
Okay, cool. We're on board for that. That sounds good. Okay, so Modern Astrology Planets Workshop. I'm just going to move that over here. Now, one thing, like I said before, was for this session, I want to go right back to the beginning and just start. We'd do a quick sort of overview of perhaps some of the origins of astrology and how it became the astrology that we have today, I guess, getting right back to the origins. Okay, so here we go today. Session one, as above, so below. We're going to explore those words. We've all heard those words before, I'm sure, and they've become sort of a catchphrase for astrology. But even those words themselves are part of an evolution. It took maybe 2,000 years for that phrase to form and to become a cornerstone of the modern astrology that we use today, the foundations of it. So we're going to look at Babylon, the concept of wandering stars, and the early observations of astrology. We'll take a brief look at tropical and sidereal astrology, how that came about, seasons versus constellations, Earth and the Sun, and the ecliptic as well. And we'll also take a brief look at Hermeticism. And Hermeticism, for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's a philosophy and a religion. Gosh, it goes back to right around probably the end of BC, right to the very, very beginning. That's laid down a lot of the foundations for a lot of the esoteric work that humanity has continued to return to for thousands of years after that. And that Hermeticism owes its origin to everything that came before that as well. So we're going to go through that at breathtaking speed, so don't worry about that. We're not going to get too bogged down. And then we'll look at the sun. So we'll look at the mythology, we'll look at the sun in astrology, and we'll look at rulership, and then we'll talk at the end there to see how we cruise through that. Okay, sounds like a lot. Okay, as above, so below. This is the first time that phrase was ever really coined, I think, going back to ancient Babylon, and we're looking at 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, Mesopotamia. This is probably the earliest original time that astrology is credited as becoming a thing, and back then it was completely agricultural. Babylonians noticed that when certain things were happening on the earth, especially the seasons, certain things were happening in the sky, and they started to create a correlation between the two. And that, in its most simple form, is the beginning of astrology. What was happening in the sky also reflects what's happening in the earth. They noticed certain constellations are in the sky at certain times during the season, and they also noticed that as a result, the cycles of the world followed the cycles of the sky too. It sounds like a really, really simple concept when we look at back at it with everything that we know. Babylon and Mesopotamia is credited as being the origin of civilization. That area in the world is the cradle of civilization, and it's that kind of critical thinking that kicked off astrology. Astrologers also noticed that people born in winter behaved a certain way. You know, children raised in winter behaved a certain way. It's interesting when you look at, World War II, for example, when the Germans occupied Holland, at that point in the war, they were on multiple fronts. They were losing a lot of the battles that they were having there, and the biggest problem they had was attrition. They didn't have enough food to feed their troops. They didn't have enough weapons, enough ammo to keep them going. One of the things they did was in Holland, they basically took all the food. They took absolutely everything, and they sent it all off to the fronts, and that created starvation in Holland. And it's interesting. One of the examples of how that manifested was Audrey Hepburn, the actress. Absolutely stunning, absolutely beautiful. And she had this incredibly svelte figure, this very slender figure, that many women tried to emulate but could not. And of course you couldn't. Audrey Hepburn was raised eating tulip buds in fields because all the food had been taken by the Axis forces and sent off to their front lines. Her and her mother, for a couple of years in World War II, only ate tulip buds. That's all they had to eat. The Germans had taken everything else. It was interesting. So she had this incredibly slender figure that nobody else could emulate. The interesting thing was, for the decades that followed, many of the people who were born in Holland, they packed on carbs very, very easily. They had a problem with weight for the next decades that followed that. And what that did was it showed us that there's a relationship between nature and nurture, that these other generations, after the German forces had been defeated and moved on, well, these were the children of a generation that had been starved of carbs, starved of food. And so the next generation of Dutch children that were born packed on weight really, really easily. And they had the complete opposite problem that Audrey Hepburn had. And that was a reaction to their environment. And that's something that went right down to a genetic level, something that they all experienced collectively together. And I guess in a really primitive form, the Babylonians had noticed that. They'd noticed that children born in periods when there was less food grew up with certain personality types. Children who grew up in summer, you know, they were gregarious and outgoing, and you know what, they didn't have any worries. They didn't tend to fret or worry like, you know, some of those other children did who were born into other seasons. So they started making these connections too. And that started to factor into their astrology. So these Babylonians are aware of the cycles of the earth. They're also aware of the cycles of the cosmos. They're seeing these constellations moving. But what they're also noticing are there are these wandering stars as well. These planets, these objects moving through the sky that don't seem to follow these cycles as well. And that became the first real study into planets. And when these planets came, they took the knowledge that they already have of the seasons, of the constellations, and they started looking for causality. They started looking for changes that these particular planets, when they came, caused and brought with them. And that became some of the earlier forms of interpretation. So that's getting right back to the absolute basics to where we started. It talks about an evolution. Babylon goes back about 6,000 to 8,000 years. So these are the origins of astrology, and everything that's happened after that has been built on these simple foundations. What this also tells you is, at its rawest form, astrology is not a belief system. Okay, people say, oh, you believe in astrology. It's a system built on observation. It's developed through critical thinking. It's by looking at these patterns that are occurring in nature, recurring in nature. We're seeing variations happening in these patterns, and people are sitting there and asking themselves why. And they're writing data down, and they're comparing it, and they're building it, and they're structuring it, and they're trying to understand it. So that's, in a lot of ways, where astrology starts from. And that's just a quick primer, I thought. But that's, for me, that's where my journey for astrology started. And I feel it doesn't hurt for people to think about astrology in that way. We're so blessed in this age in that gosh, you know, the scientific and the difficult parts of astrology we can do with software. We don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. And I think back to these guys thousands of years ago who had to sit down. They barely had paper, and they sat down and they studied all of this and they tried to make sense of everything that was going on around there. Gosh, what a level of commitment they must have had in order to, bring these changes and bring these gifts to humanity, and that's what they were. So, I just thought we'd touch on that today. That for me is where astrology begins, and I feel it's something that needs to be mentioned and talked about. Does anybody have any comments on that? Any thoughts, any questions or anything like that? I wasn't there, so I can't tell you what they were thinking back in the time. But, does anybody have anything they want to add to that, Because that's a lot, I think. No? Okay, cool. Let's move on. I promise that would be painless and quick. Okay, tropical versus sidereal. So the big question is whether you're going to follow the seasons or whether you're going to follow the cycles of the cosmos. Um, Tropical astrology studies the relationship of the Earth against the Sun. And it looks at the seasons. It keys off the seasons. So if this is a really, really fundamental explanation of something that's quite complicated. But at the end of the day, tropical astrology focuses on the cycles of the seasons in preference to the cycles of the constellations. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but the dates that I have for the signs on the introductory course on Udemy tend to follow more the celestial than the sidereal than the tropical. They're actually deviated, they're different. And the reason is, at the time back in Babylon, or when they first started recording these dates and putting them down, everything sort of kind of matched up, but it's actually deviated now. There's quite a difference between the cycles of the constellations and the cycles of the season. Sometimes you'll notice you look up at the night sky, should be just the start of a particular sign, yet the constellation for that has already progressed. It's already quite far in the sky. So there is already a deviation between the two. Western astrology tends to lean into tropical. So that's prioritizing the seasons over what's happening in the constellations. Vedic astrology is more about constellations. It's a lot more complicated. I don't know if people know, but right now at this time, there are 88 constellations in the sky. We just focus on the 12 that more or less align up with the cycles of what's happening on the Earth. So we're only paying attention to a small amount of the constellations that are up there. But that's the difference straight off from the go-get. So back in the time of Babylon, they were blessed in a time where they didn't have to make that distinction. Everything was more or less lining up. If they had come to that realization 200-300 years later, we'd have different constellations in the sky. So what we're seeing is a snapshot of what was happening around the time that people first started building these relationships. So that covers the point of deviation that I wanted to make. Those are deviated dates. Maybe once or twice a year, I'll get an email from somebody saying, dude, what the hell is up with your dates? They don't match what I see on Google. That's the same explanation that I give. It's probably an Easter egg from the courses. That's why the dates are what they are. Those are deviated dates, so slightly different. Now, what that also means is, since we're looking at the Earth, the relationship between the Earth and the Sun and tropical, we're not too concerned about the seasons themselves. The seasons tend to follow the cycle of the Earth as it rotates around the Sun. What that means is, because one of the questions I get all the time is, well, okay, what we're seeing in terms of constellations and stuff more or less aligns up with the northern hemisphere, but it's all different down in the southern hemisphere. Well, in terms of relationship to the Earth to the Sun, it doesn't really matter. It's not a big deviation at all. Okay. So whether you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, the position of the constellations in relation to the Earth, observable or not, tend to be what they are. So that's a consistency. And people, if you've been thinking about that, well, that's generally the consensus, I think, for many astrologers. Again, since we're looking at the relationship of the Earth to the Sun, the seasons are what they are, the constellations are what they are. They don't change in that regard. What we see on the Earth is the only real variation on that. Okay. And the last point, since we're using the planets, the rotation of the Earth, that makes us aware of the ecliptic, or the elliptic as other people call it. It's the line of orbit that the Earth has around the Sun. So that becomes enormously important. All of the planets in the solar system more or less align up to that same line, and that's why we get consistency. And that's interesting. You know, again, there was a lot that I took for granted in astrology and stuff like that, and I never really explored the science of it. Well, that's why, you know, we've had such a reliable model for so long. And you'll see it on a clear night if you go out into the country and you look up, you'll see that constellation line of the ecliptic. You can see multiple planets all dotted along that line if you're lucky. We went to, a town called Woomera, a military base down in South Australia. You'd be familiar with it, Sandra, just sort of 2/3 of the way from Adelaide to Coopabedi. And there's an observatory there, and we sat there and we looked. And on the same night, we could see Jupiter, Mars, Venus, I think. There were at least three planets that we could all see at the same time, and they were all sitting on the same line. And you can see it all in a really, really clear sky. Everything in the universe is remarkably ordered, so much so that we make the mistake of thinking that's the way that it should be. And we know, you know, once you start living, that's just not the way it is. But everything follows that line except for Uranus, who's pretty much the rebel of the whole bunch. He spins in the opposite direction and goes on a skewed angle. That's the only planet that doesn't really follow the great celestial order. And as astrologers, that should come as no great surprise to any of us. The moon has a variation of about 5 degrees on the ecliptic, but it's still pretty close. So it's following the Earth's orbit of the sun and with a slight variation of its own based on our own gravity well. But that being said, every model you've seen of the solar system on the side with all these circles is sort of kind of maybe pretty true. When you step back and look at it at a galactic level, you see the sun is an enormous fireball hurtling at great speed, and everything's sort of, the gravity well of every planet's just kind of staggered off from there. It's almost like debris following a big burning ball through space. It's beautiful to see. You should look it up. But at the end of the day, we have a fairly reliable system. We are so reliable that we're able, even thousands of years later, to make predictions. And thousands of years later, we can look at an ephemeris, or we don't have to anymore. We can look at software and we can see where that moon or that sun or that planet was 2, 3, 5,000, or even 6 to 8,000 years ago, back in Babylon when they were first looking at it. We can look at those points and accurately calculate where they were at that time as well. And that's the foundation of astrology, is predictability. So how does that sound? Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say, or any comments they want to make about that? I've got this horrible suspicion that by the time we start talking about the sun, everybody will be exhausted. Okay. All right, Hermeticism. Hermeticism is a religion and a philosophy that came up just after, it would have been around probably 800 AD, I think, that it really coalesced into something. And it's a combination of the study of the gods Thoth from Egypt. Thoth is the keeper of wisdom. He's the presider of the dead. He's the god of magic, of music, of medicine, all of that sort of stuff. And Hermes, the Greek god equivalent of Mercury, he is the messenger of the gods. He was also the go-between between worlds. He's one of the only figures that can move between the land of the dead and the land of the living. He's credited with leading souls into the world of the dead as well. He's a trickster. Again, too, he's got a connection to medicine. He's a mediator. And you'll find it's interesting that these energies align and they overlap. Even despite the difference, there was a difference in time between the two. It was fascinating to me to read that back in the time of Egypt, woolly mammoths still walked the world, right back in those days when the Egyptian Empire was still forming. But there's a lot of crossover between these two. And what Hermeticism is, it's a religion and a philosophy that combines a lot of the teachings of the two. And this is the first time that the words as above, so below were properly coalesced, I think, and they were written down on an object called the Emerald Tablet, inscribed, and this became the principle, the template for modern astrology in a lot of ways. I understand that the Emerald Tablet eventually made its way into the Middle East, into Arabia, and this became the foundation of Arabic and Islamic astrology. Which for thousands of years was perhaps some of the strongest forms of astrology the world saw. And this Emerald Tablet was an example of that. Hermeticism puts forward three fundamental concepts, and the first is alchemy. We're all familiar with alchemy, and for about 1,000 years, alchemy was perhaps the example of science for the human race. It was a process of transformation, and alchemy. My screen, I've got a screen on the left here. If I keep looking to the left, that's what I'm doing. Alchemy is about natural transformations that mimic spiritual transformations. The goal of astrology was to turn mundane materials like lead into refined materials like gold. And they felt if they could do that, that they would understand the relationship between God and earth. They would be able to wield perhaps even the same creative power of God. So that was the goal of alchemy. That being said, it's even transformations like fermentation and things like that. That's considered alchemy. Anything that takes something lower and turns it into a higher form is considered alchemy. So in that way, processed food now probably is alchemy. We take something that's organic and good for you, and we turn it into rubbish that could be mass produced. So I suppose that's a bastardization of alchemy in its own way, but the principles are the same. We've got that. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, we have theurgy, which is the opposite. It's the work to reach divine consciousness. So it's matter reaching towards the divine. And it's interesting when you look at these 3 points. For many people, this is the ascension of consciousness. This is the journey of consciousness. We start in dense matter and we start striving towards a higher and finer source. And for many of us, the further we go up that mountainside, the more we realize that divine source is within us, but it's not. It's outside us as well. And there's a relationship between the two. And really what we're trying to do is bring those 2 points together. We have form for a reason, but inside every one of us, there is a divine spark that is yearning for connection, that is yearning for consciousness and for growth and for understanding of how the universe works and our place in it as well. When I look at alchemy, when I look at us born into densest matter, within alchemy, it's the realization at a conscious level that we're alone. And I think for the idea of human consciousness, I think this loneliness for us is probably the most powerful thing, in that it's allowed us to separate ourselves from the animal kingdom. But at the same time, it comes with a terrible curse, and that we are all innately aware of our lack of connection, that we're separate from everything else. And for every one of us, I'm sure we can all look back in our own lives and find a time where that sense of loneliness and that sense of separation and isolation was so overpowering. And I think that in a lot of ways is what guarantees that we will always try and be a better version of ourselves than we are. I think that's where the seeds of sentience lie. There's no scientific formula for it. I think it's the moment that we realize that we are alone and that we are individuals. I think that's what's allowed us to become the species that we are and separate ourselves from the rest of the world. But I'll let you ponder that. Maybe we'll talk about it some other time. That's something that's always bothered me. And we're all moving towards something higher and finer. And ironically, in our early steps of doing that, we're always looking at the sky. Right back when we go back to the earliest civilizations, back to our shamanistic cultures, we're all looking at the sky and we're all looking at nature around us, and we're creating relationships between the two. So that describes the relationship between alchemy and theurgy. And in between that is astrology. That's a third component. And this asserts the idea that celestial bodies influence the earth. They influence the journey, but they do not dictate or define. So what's happening in the sky, what we see, is not deterministic. It's not going to make decisions for us and say, this is the sort of life you're going to live, this is where things are going to go, and this is how things are going to happen. It is not a predefined journey, it's not a predefined destination, which overcomes the argument when people come up and say, oh, well, if you believe in astrology, how come you're not rich? Of course not. We'd love to be rich, but the game's just not working that way. And we're not using magic. We're not using superpowers or anything like that. We're using critical thinking and observation, a refined form of it, to make better decisions and better life choices at the end of the day. And that's what astrology was to Hermeticists. Astrology is a bridge between the lower and the higher. As above, so below. It's a coalescing of those words. It sees those words in multiple ways. When you explore the duality of it, which was important to Hermeticism, they accepted that duality as a part of our world. They also accepted that God was a magician. Astrology is a bridge, but it's not a guide and it's not a set path. So all of us will travel differently. All of us will experience things differently, but along the way, certain things will happen. And from those certain things, we can create a model in our mind of how things might turn out and of any opportunities that might be available or any things that we need to be aware of before they happen as well. So Hermeticism is the first rigid form of astrology. I guess it's a combination of a lot of the different teachings, everything from Babylon and Mesopotamia right up to ancient Greece around that time, shamanistic thinking, because that contributed a lot to alchemy, religion, which contributed a lot to theurgy. It all coalesced in Hermeticism. So that's where a lot of the, I guess, the astrology that we use for today comes from. So, does anybody have any questions about that or anything they want to say or anything they'd like to add? Okay. Was that interesting? Did anybody find that interesting, or did I sort of go off on an air sign arc there and alienate the audience and then drop the mic at the end?
Oh, it was very interesting. This part about Hermes, because that's part of one of the things when I was studying astrology that we had to learn
Yes.
about those 7 principles,
Yes.
of
Yeah.
the Kibalion, they call it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Look, our privilege in this age is that we don't have to learn astrology the same way. Before you had to join a federation, and they're still running now. If you want to become fully accredited as an astrologer, there's exams you've got to do. You've got to be able to, at the very least, at the most fundamental level, you need to be able to calculate and create charts by hand using an ephemeris, not software. And that's people talk about astrology as being a fringe science, but that's the scientific side of it. Most of us don't even have to touch that stuff. That's done for us now. Placidus that most of us use now is such a privilege because Placidus was a nightmare to calculate. You couldn't just look at the Earth and the Sun. You had to also look at the position. The geographical position had a massive impact on it. You're right. All of these principles there, I think, are still in the learning, and that was one of the things I tried to raise right at the beginning. I think as we've been given a much easier, and I'm probably guilty in a way, maybe of giving these courses where it's so much easier to understand the principles and stuff like that. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that allows us to really tie into our own experience and our intuition a lot more. And I think maybe earlier astrologers didn't have that luck themselves. But yeah, there were a lot of things you had to know. And Hermes, the relationship of Hermes and humanity, they were definitely a fundamental part of that. So, thanks for that, Antoinette. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Did anybody else want to say or add anything before we move on?
I just appreciate it. It's fascinating, and you've done a lot of research, and I appreciate the work you've done to explain this because I didn't know any of this.
Oh, wonderful,
I didn't.
wonderful.
Yeah, I didn't know the origin of as above, so below. I didn't know it was that old in its origin, and that gives it to me a lot more meaning. It feels like something that just people have just started talking about recently. It's like, no. So
Not at all.
that's
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, yeah, its origins go right back. It's funny. I'm part of a few science Facebook groups as well, and every month, at least once, somebody's going to put something up about astrology, some sort of meme or something like that, knocking it. Astrology has been consistent for about 6 to 8,000 years now. We haven't really deviated a lot. When new things happen, we incorporate them. We don't stand there like, get into tenuous squabbles and try and argue things out. If a new planet's discovered, we incorporate it, we understand it, and we start working with it if it's appropriate. We're still debating whether there's a 13th sign in the zodiac. But there's a solid argument for why there should be, so who knows, maybe in time it might be accepted and things like that. If we had 28 days in every month, then if the first day of a sign was on a Monday, then it would be for every sign. would have no problem. It would always be everything would be nice and tidy and organized. And maybe that's exactly why we will never have a 13th sign, because I think that's just where we're expecting the universe to fall in line with our own expectations. But hey, we're vain by nature. That's humanity. But we've had a pretty consistent narrative for a long time. Science, and when you look at Hermeticism, science is built on the bones of all that critical thinking that it's accumulated. So there's an interesting book for anybody who wants to read it by Evan Dawkins called The Mind of God. This is going back to the 90s, where a group of scientists set out to use science as a weapon to kill God and failed. So I hear at least one of them ended up in an asylum. And the others had to, at the very least, concede agnosticism. So it's an interesting book. And I think when you start looking at stuff like that, at least for me as an air sign, you really start to understand the guts and the essence of astrology and why it's so important and why it's such a part of our DNA, and celestial bodies influence but do not dictate. What that also means is those planets and those celestial bodies and those constellations, they don't care about us at the end of the day too. None of what they do is personal. It's going to keep ticking along whether we're here or not, so when people start bitching about their Saturn or their Mars or stuff like that, sure, it's very real and you feel it and stuff like that, but it's not personal and it'll go away. So like it has for thousands of years and before we're even aware that they were there. So thanks, Michelle. I'm glad you said that, because like I said, for me, that if I'm a scientific thinker, if I hadn't found this stuff, I would not be interested in astrology. I'm intensely cynical and critical in the way that I think. So, and this created enough room for me to believe, a lot of different things, because it's not a belief system. That's something I hold on to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, actually, because the most cynical and skeptical are always the best teachers, because you learned every piece of it because you wanted to dispute it. I mean, it's the same way with integrative medicine and a lot of even some of the spiritual teachers. It's that they didn't fully believe it and then they had no choice. It's like, because like you said, it's not a belief.
Yeah.
It's a structure. It's a foundation. And I feel the same way about the scientific piece of it. It makes me nuts when people poo-poo it. And I have a tendency to talk in ways that are very woo-woo.
Yeah.
Like, even though I am very scientific minded, my background is in biology and science. So I'm not totally that way, but when I speak of things, I go that route.
Yeah.
So I like someone like you who can articulate it with real facts that I can kind of come back to if anyone's ever challenging me. So,
I find 9 times out of 10, if somebody's challenging you, they don't want to change your belief system anyway,
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's usually not worth the argument. But
and it normally dissolves
sometimes
into, well, you believe what you want to believe and I'll believe what I want to believe. I'm of an age now, I guess I don't get into that discussion, but it does come up, and you're right. And it does irk me when I see a meme come up when somebody shows astrology is looking goofy or whatever the case may be. And it's generally from non-scientists who post them anyway, because interestingly, I've seen hard scientists defend astrology before. Well, how can you so casually disregard 6,000 years of critical thinking? What
Right.
gives you the power to do that? You'd have to understand a thing before you decide that it can't work. You tell me your understanding of astrology. And people start talking about gods and stuff like that. And that's the interesting thing, because when you start getting into the pantheons of the gods, the mythologies and things like that, the natures and the characteristics of the gods tend to follow the constellations and not the other way around. We aren't just sitting down one day and somebody thought, hey, let's invent a lightning god. The template's already there in nature. They're already seeing it. They're looking for explanation. And at the end, what you see is not an explanation. You just see something that's a combining of all the facts that we know about that, and then a humanizing of it and things like that. The festivals of the gods tend to match up with the seasons. For Mars, the Festival of Mars happened in October, which was around the time that all the soldiers would be coming home in the Roman Empire. And after that, we were going into winter, the worst time to wage war. So Mars was a celebration of the end of the season of war. Demeter was it was the harvest, and also the optimal time of the year to marriage for children. and things like that too. So the natures of the gods tend to follow the natures of the constellations, and they all tend to align up with what nature's showing us, not the other way around. We don't invent gods and then suddenly nature changes its behavior to follow the gods. It does not work that way. So yeah, and that way the gods aren't an explanation. They're basically a description of our understanding of everything we know about that particular time and how that impacts us as a species. Some of those gods are kind to us. Some of those gods are malefic. Some of those gods don't care about us, you know, and that just reflects our relationship with the seasons and the world around us. That's all it is, you know. So by saying that you believe in astrology doesn't mean that you worship Roman and Greek gods and stuff like that and wear a little tinfoil hat and bark at the moon. You know, it doesn't necessarily. You can if you want to. I'm not going to stop anybody from doing that. But it's not a
Well,
requirement.
when people tell me that they don't believe in astrology, I just tell them that it's really not a belief system. You either understand it or you don't. It's a language.
Yeah.
And then they just kind of go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And then, you know, we can go from there. So that's how I handle it. It's really not, it's not whether you believe it or not, Mars is up there and Jupiter is up there and the sun and the moon. I mean, it's happening. So it's not really a belief system.
Yeah. We're not born yesterday. We didn't just start studying this stuff yesterday. I think we've all
Right.
seen
It's
enough
like 6,000
proof.
years ago. So
Yeah, but I'm talking as individuals too. I think all of us sitting here today, we've seen enough astrology to know that it is having an impact somewhere in our lives. That's good enough for
Oh,
me.
definitely. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's fantastic for me that we can sit and have this discussion, you know, with other people who've noticed the same stuff. We feel like a 12 steps group somehow, don't we? You know, we're all getting together
Yes.
and talking about how, you know, hi, I'm Damien, I'm an astrologer. So
I've got the sun in the fourth house.
yeah, I
you
know, and everybody, oh, you know, that's okay.
Oh,
That's
no.
okay. You know, so, all
We're
bitching
here
when
for
Satan
you.
comes around. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it feels like that sometimes too, but it's a shared journey. I'm just lovely to be able to share this journey with everybody. Okay.